The steps for purchasing application packages fit into this traditional SDLC model. More specifically, it can also be depicted in terms of those three SDLC phases, such as definition phase, construction phase, and implementation phase. There are some differences though, and that's why it's called the modified SDLC approach. Although the phases are the same, the content of some of those phases are different. One difference is that the definition phase, the traditional definition SDLC phase, is supplemented with 5 additional steps. And the second difference is that the construction phase is a bit shortened because, by definition, when you're purchasing a software application, then you don't do much construction because all the software components are already given to you by the vendor. And the implementation phase is more or less the same. So let's talk about the definitions phase, more specifically about the steps comprising the definitions phase. The first step in the definition phase is feasibility analysis. The most important goal of feasibility analysis is to determine whether the proposed system is economically, meaning from a cost standpoint, technically, meaning from a hardware, software, and networking standpoint, and operationally, here we're talking about business processes, business operations, feasible. In other words, does the proposed system suit us from the cost standpoint, from the perspective on how much it will cost, how it will interact with our existing hardware, software, and networking and data components, and also how it will support our existing business operations. If it's feasible, then you need to, then maybe you will decide to go ahead with that decision to purchase a particular application. Of course, when you're considering feasibility, you need to reflect on building versus buying. You need to do some preliminary investigation of available package systems, if in theory there are some package systems available that can meet your requirements. And then you need to do a detailed cost-benefit analysis for budgeting and monitoring purposes. Again, here we're talking about a detailed layout for financial analysis or financial layout for the decision of purchasing as opposed to developing or building something internally. The second step in the definition phase is requirements definition. As when creating custom software, requirements definition is a critical step in the purchase methodology. You need to spend quite a bit of time thinking about your requirements, because if you really nail down your requirements in a clear, specific manner, then you are less likely to buy something that doesn't suit your purpose. But rather than creating detailed requirements for in-house development, this step focuses on defining functional requirements needed to develop a request for proposal, or RFP. RFP is a document that is sent out to potential vendors that can potentially supply a software package that meets your requirements. So those requirements, they're formulated from that external perspective. In other words, those requirements are formulated not for the internal development team, but for external vendors, so that they can understand better your organization and the kind of needs your organization has in relation to a software package that you're thinking about buying. Then you can create a short list of suitable packages, eliminate all but a few promising candidate packages, and then evaluate available features of those packages that are included in this limited list, compatibility with current hardware and software, and also vendor reputation or vendor track record. Because as I mentioned previously, when you're deciding to buy or purchase a software, you're also investing into the relationship with a particular software vendor. So this needs to be evaluated at that stage as well. Then you can establish criteria for selection. Business and IT team members or IS team members, they need to work together to determine those selection criteria, both from a technical standpoint and also from a business standpoint. Because there's no such thing as an ideal package, there's no such thing as a package that meets all of your requirements. So to loosen up those selection criteria a little bit, you may want to decide as a team which selection criteria are mandatory and which are optional. So some examples of criteria for software package selection. For example, in relation to the package itself, you may want to specify functional capabilities or features of the package system, Also, technical requirements the software must satisfy, and also some requirements in relation to documentation, quality of documentation provided, so that you can get a sense whether your internal team can understand the package, can support it, can maintain it in the future. Also, you may want to specify some selection criteria in relation to the vendor, such as business characteristics of the vendor firm. For example, you may say that it has to be a large corporation, it has to be in business for at least 10 years, and also some criteria in relation to vendor support, because support becomes critical after you buy and install, implement your software application. So you may want to evaluate the kind of support options that you have with vendors, candidate vendors that can potentially supply a software package that you need. After that, you can go ahead and develop and distribute an RFP document. RFP stands for Request for Proposal. It's a formal document sent to potential software vendors, inviting them to submit a proposal describing how their software package will meet the company needs. Typically, an RFP document gives vendors information about systems objectives and requirements. In other words, what are you trying to accomplish with the software package that you're looking for? Environment in which the system will be used, meaning some information about your existing IT infrastructure, about your company, general business information. Also, general criteria used to evaluate proposals. In other words, you will tell them how you're going to evaluate which vendor seems to meet your needs. And also some additional conditions for submitting a proposal. In other words, who is qualified to submit a proposal, or what needs to be done so that the proposal is accepted. A typical outline of an RFP document is listed here. So introduction, you tell a little bit about the structure and scope of this document, the main objectives. You will give some background information on your company from a business standpoint. You'll give information about the business environment or industry where the company operates, and also information about existing IT infrastructure, meaning existing hardware, software, and networking components. In the second part, you may give information for vendor response, guidelines, what are the sections that need to be included, what are the essential pieces of information. Also, vendor response, how it should look like. General evaluation process, meaning how those responses will be evaluated. Then in part 3, you will provide detailed requirements in relation to vendor, documentation, package, hardware and system environment, meaning what kind of package you need and what kind of environment it needs to operate. Some requirements in relation to data and databases, tuning and measurement, how you're going to measure the system, what kind of outputs, the system is supposed to provide, and how you're going to measure whether those outputs meet your requirements. And also, for example, functional requirements, what exactly the system needs to do. In part 4, you can talk about cost, what you're expecting to pay in general in this cost summary, what will be the non-recurring and recurring cost. You will also talk about the kind of maintenance agreement that you expect, what's going to happen with new releases, how the software will be updated. Also, price guarantee, in other words, how much you're willing to pay and what you're willing to pay for. So all this information is included in an RFP document. After you distribute this RFP document to potential vendors, you can collect data based on it. First of all, vendors' responses from RFP. Then, after you collect initial RFPs, vendors' responses from your RFP document, you may invite some vendors for demonstration. So that will be your additional source of data. Also, you may want to collect references from users in other companies, in relation to those limited set of RFP responses that you have received. So all this information is used by the project team to evaluate how well available packages meet companies' needs. After you select which package you will go with, you need to negotiate a contract with this vendor that you actually select. Of course, using an attorney for contracting with a vendor reduces likelihood of future legal problems. An attorney can help a company to compose a contract that looks at all the contingencies, so that if something unexpected happens, the company is well protected. There are a lot of things that go into a contract with a vendor, but most contracts, they can be classified into fixed price contracts, meaning with all those things specified, you agree to pay a certain price. And also you have cost reimbursement contracts, where the purchasing company, meaning your organization, pays the vendor's direct and indirect cost. So in other words, you don't have a fixed price in mind, fixed price contract in mind. You're allowing certain contingencies to happen, and you're willing to assume financial responsibilities for some of those contingencies. If you do that, then this is something that may be more attractive to your software vendor, but at the same time, you as an organization, you will assume a much greater risk. Also, when you develop a contract, you may want to specify contingencies where the software that is delivered to you does not meet your specifications. Because if that happens, if the software that you purchase does not meet your specification, then you have three options: modifying the package, and this is something that has to be included in the contract. In other words, if something is not working on your side, what is the responsibility of the software vendor to do any modifications? Now, this can be a tricky part. Software vendors naturally, they don't like to do any modifications for obvious reasons. Number one, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to do those modifications. Number three, sometimes it's a very complex thing to do. That reminds me, when I was working for a software company as a consultant, as an implementation consultant, our developers kept telling us, look, do whatever you want with the client, promise your client anything except one thing, which is doing any kind of customizations to the software itself. Because they were telling, it's not that we're not willing to make those customizations, but the problem becomes that if we do some customization, sometimes the whole architecture falls apart. In other words, you do small modification in one part of the system, then some other parts are malfunctioning or contradicting for that modification that you made. So the developers team tried to discourage us from promising any kind of modifications to clients. So yeah, if you want to modify it, then your vendor needs to be willing to do that. If it's not included, then you may want to change your internal procedures to accommodate the way the software is without making any changes. And if you cannot do that, then you can just live with the differences, right? You just need to somehow find a workaround or ignore it. If you cannot change your internal procedures and you cannot do any modifications to the existing package. So this is the end of the definition phase. So now we're going to talk about construction phase. Now, construction phase is a bit shortened because, once again, when you're buying software, you're not constructing anything. Typically, the vendor does not even provide you the source code. It just gives you ready-made components and modules. Nevertheless, some construction, some coding, some technical work may be required for your existing system components, for your existing software, hardware, maybe networking components to accommodate the modules that you're purchasing. Also, during construction phase, you will do user testing. First of all, user acceptance testing of configured packages, meaning does this installation work from a user standpoint? Your internal IT specialist or vendor representatives can help you to test the system on your organization's equipment. In other words, it's something that is not on the user side, it's something more on the technical and the infrastructure side. You will see whether the components can interoperate with your existing hardware, software, and networking components. So those are the two types of testing that you may want to do on the user side and also on the IT infrastructure side. When it comes to the implementation phase, you have the same steps as under the classical SDLC framework: installation, operation, and maintenance. Installation typically involves planning for installation, training users, data cleanup, and then conversion of data or transition from an old system to a new system. In the installation phase, success depends on quality of vendor support, because you may have a lot of questions about installing the package that you purchased. And also it depends on package size and complexity. If it's something small, you can easily install it. But if it's something complex, then you will have hard time, training, converting data, ensuring interoperability with existing components. Special attention needs to be given to training, especially if there are significant changes in the way employees do their work. Typically, this is the bottleneck. I mean, if you think about it, any information system ultimately developed for end users. If for whatever reason your end users cannot use your software, then whatever you do on the technical side or whatever you do prior to user acceptance, it doesn't matter. So you want to make sure that you train users, because at the end of the day, it's them who will be using the system and they'll be determining whether the system is useful or not. That's when change management becomes very important, where you help individual users, departments, and the organization as a whole to transition to a new system. The operations step is the same whether the package was built or bought. Initial success of the operations step highly depends on good communication with the vendor. If there are any kind of operational issues, you need to have an open communication line with the vendor, so you can ask questions, you can quickly fix operational issues. Long-term success also depends on how well the system has been integrated into the company ongoing operations. If the system keeps contradicting with existing technology components or, most importantly, business practices, then most likely it doesn't have a good long-term future. After a while, it will be discontinued. The maintenance phase, the maintenance step under the implementation phase, is also very important. Commonly, the software vendor, meaning the company from which you're buying your software package, handles maintenance as specified in the contract. That arrangement has a number of advantages. It can actually help you, save money, because you don't need to have an internal support team. It will be handled externally. But the disadvantage is that you, as an organization, you'll be dependent on the vendor a lot. So if vendor makes any changes, let's say, to pricing, you'll be dependent because you don't have an internal team who can handle maintenance. And in fact, a lot of software vendors, they take advantage of their clients in this maintenance phase. So what happens is that they give you a very low price when it comes to purchasing a software and installing it. But when it comes to maintenance, that's when you pay a lot of money over time. But at the same time, if you choose a particular vendor, you understand that without maintenance, the software is of little value. So you have no choice but to go over those maintenance arrangements that may cost you much more money than actually purchasing and installing a particular software application. And also maintenance, sometimes you get this maintenance contract, but you may not be able to get the specific changes that you want. In other words, the updates that the company is making may not be necessarily aligned with what your company needs. So outsourcing maintenance is not really a 100% headache-free solution. There may be some disadvantages or issues coming up later. So that's the last step under the implementation phase, and that completes our overview of the modified SDLC approach to purchased software packages. And that also concludes part 2 of Chapter 10.